Hey y'all, it's Chris here with Rockin Farm. We're coming back for part 3 in the what to look for in your land, which is all a part of a series that I've been calling First Steps to Getting Your Homestead. Now in the first part that I called like video 5 part A, we covered 2 or 3 different topics. Some of those topics, like I said, were probably the most important in my opinion. In the second one, we covered a few more topics, and here we're just going to kind of round it out. Now, that's not to say that these 3 videos are the end-all, be-all, and that they cover all the information for what you need to look for in a piece of land. But, you know, they give you a really good idea, and they kind of get you started. So I guess the first thing to talk about in this last part here is location of the property, neighbors, etc. Now, we started talking a little bit about location of the property when we were talking about like medical services, things of that nature. But you need to really kind of look at like what you need from your property in relation to your life. When you first move onto your homestead, it ain't the greatest idea to jump into too many things too quick. So, I mean, it's going to be a long time, in all honesty, probably years, before you get to a place where you're fairly sufficient, self-sufficient, I guess I should say, as far as meat and vegetables and all that kind of stuff. That first year you plant that first garden, it'll be all right, but it takes years to improve the soil to the point where you have like these really bountiful harvests. And even then you have really horrible years. So how close is the closest grocery store? How much effort does it take to get there? What kind of space do you have for food preservation? If you got a lot of freezers and you got a lot of fridges, then, you know, you can do that hour and a half trip to the grocery store once a month or something like that. But if you're going from a lifestyle where you go to the grocery store every single solitary week, or in some cases stop by the grocery store on your way home from work daily, well, you're not just going to jump straight into a lifestyle where you've got once a month or once every 3 month grocery trips. It's just not going to happen. You got to be realistic. So how important is living close to a grocery store to you? Are you in a position where you have no need for off-farm income, or do you have a full-time job somewhere? And if so, how close do you need to be to that full-time job? Part of the reason we bought the property that we bought is because I like living out in the country, and it's very rural where I live. But I'm about 20 minutes away from a town that has everything anybody could ever want from a town. I don't even like going out to eat at restaurants, y'all, but I'll tell you what, just about every restaurant you could ever want to eat at is in a town that's 20 minutes away from me. That town has the grocery store. That town has a Tractor Supply. That town has a Home Depot. That town has a Lowe's. So it's never tough for me to get up there and get building supplies, etc. Now, besides that, we have a little small town that's even closer to us. It's got a little mom and pop grocery store. It's got a gas station. So in about 10 minutes, I can get down and fill up some fuel tanks. And that little town is where the feed store that I use most of the time is at as well. So it makes it fairly convenient to grab the trailer, jog down into town 10 minutes away, load up on feed, and come home. Now, neighbors is a little bit more of a tough one, but it's definitely not impossible. You can find out what the people that live next to the property you're thinking about buying are like. It doesn't take a genius to figure out how to jump online and do things like criminal searches, etc. So you can get that kind of an idea about the neighbors. But the biggest thing that I would suggest is just talk to the people who already lived on the property, or talk to the people who own the property. There is somebody out there that is going to buy a property regardless of who the neighbors are, because they just want the property. A seller knows that, so they don't necessarily have a whole lot of incentive to lie to you. I'm not about to say that there ain't nobody out there that isn't going to lie to you, but I've noticed that generally speaking, people know I can get this property sold. I don't need to be dishonest to get it sold. The property will sell itself because of location, etc., etc. A lot of times when you're talking about land that has a home on it, it's kind of ready to move on, it's out in the country. If I remember correctly, we were one of 7 people who wanted this house. Now, it didn't turn into any kind of a bidding war, and I'm glad, because what we could afford to pay is what we could afford to pay. We weren't going to be able to bump that price at all. What it did do is turn into a scenario where the seller had to make a decision. What we actually chose to do is we wrote a letter to the seller and had our real estate agent deliver it to them. And they read our letter, and after we signed on the property and had our keys in our hand, we had an opportunity to talk to the couple that owned this property one more time. And they flat out told us it was our letter to them that sold them on letting us buy the house. Found out from our realtor a little while down the line that they actually had a couple of buyers that were willing to offer a few thousand more than we were. but they liked the idea of passing the property on to somebody who was going to enjoy it as much as they had. Still on the topic of neighbors, drive around the area a little bit. You can tell a lot about people by just the way they keep their land. For example, the gentleman across the street from me, he has all kinds of junk out on his property. But I'll tell you what, y'all, he may have 17 broken cars down over there, but they're all lined up in a straight line. He has some piles of what a lot of people might consider junk, but it's like 2 or 3 piles and they're all right there close together. And you can kind of tell by looking at them that like one is metal and one is construction debris. And so, I mean, yes, he's got a lot of junk, but his junk is very organized, and that tells me a lot about that man. Now, I'm not going to lie, he's a little bit of a grumpy old fella, but the bottom line is he just wants to be left alone, and I pretty much just want to be left alone, so we ain't got to talk, we just got to be neighbors. All right, y'all, now I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of get this ugly mug off the camera. We're going to talk about structures and layout, and I'm going to be showing you a lot more of the structures and layout on my property. All right, y'all, so when it comes to looking at this new property, it either has structures or it doesn't have structures. That's just kind of the end of it. Now, if it doesn't have structures, then you're just kind of looking at the land. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. If it does have structures, then you have to just kind of determine like the condition of those structures. Are they going to continue to be usable for you? And, do they make sense as far as where they're located on the property? This is honestly something that's going to be a really big concern to you if you are starting to build things on your property as well. Because I'll tell you what, you can put up a barn, but there ain't nothing worse than putting up a barn, realizing it's in the wrong spot, and then having to take down a barn and put it up someplace else. Now, if your barn is already there, you're just going to deal with it to some extent, and that's exactly what we've had to do. Our barn isn't in the greatest place. It sits down real low on the property. A lot of water runs down the property from the top of the property, so if we get a really wet season, it can get a little mucky in the barn. I've had to do some things like install some water diversion in order to kind of help with that problem. But you know what? This was a relatively simple project. Dig a nice big ditch and fill it up with big rocks. And believe it or not, it has worked really well. The water comes down off the property. It has to fill this ditch up first, and then it will start to soak into the soil. It's mounded up enough here close to the barn that in order for the soil inside the barn to start getting wet, it takes a ton of rain. Most of this starts to soak in and it follows the contour of the land, which means that if I dug down a few feet inside the barn, I would find moist soil, but the stuff on top stays dry. We've had to do a lot of repairing and a lot of work, and we're in the middle of a lot of projects on this barn, but it was nice to find a barn that had a few indoor stalls and then also had this nice big overhang. Once I get all this roof patched back up, this is going to be a really nice place to use for things like parking the tractor. As of right now, I'm able to use this middle area as a workshop until I get something better. It'll be feed storage in the future. You can see Panchita back there hanging out with the dog. So I've got farrowing pens for my pigs. I use this room, which was an old tack room, as a grow out pen for my poultry. So all in all, the barn has served us very well, and I'm super happy that it's on the property. I don't think I would have been able to do as much as I've done, even though it's kind of an old junky barn. By modifying and changing the barn to meet the needs that I had for it, I've been able to do a lot of stuff on this farm. I don't think we would be nearly as advanced as we are in our pig program and stuff if we didn't have the barn. When we bought the property, it already had the carport on it. Again, because of the way that everything that these people did when they built this house 40 years ago, it was all centered around having a creek that runs across the back of the property that has water in it a good share of the year. I'm not gonna lie. I enjoy having that running creek back there as much as the original property builders probably did. But they also weren't foreshadowing anything like the fact that in 2015 there was going to be so much flooding in Texas that the government, in their infinite wisdom, were going to totally reclassify all the flood zones. And even though the house did not flood, they were going to go ahead and push that 500-year floodplain all the way up to cover the entire house. So now we're stuck paying flood insurance. But obviously we're getting a whole lot of use out of having this carport here. Keeps my tractor dry, keeps my trailer from rotting out. If I get home from somewhere and I've got stuff in the back of the trailer, I don't have to empty it out right away. It came with kind of dual sheds in a way. So obviously we got one shed here, which is pretty sizable. but then there's another little storage shed on the back end of it. And that's real handy because that way we don't have to rent storage units. The house itself is not at all what my wife or I would ever call our dream home, but you know what? It keeps our head dry. It keeps us warm at night. It gives us a place to live while we build up enough money to pay off mortgages, etc. And someday we'll go ahead and build our dream home on the property. Now, when we do build that dream home, I'm gonna put the back of the house about 10 feet north of what is now the front of the house, and pull this entire house up out of the floodplain and get rid of that flood insurance. Because I'll tell you what, y'all, flood insurance ain't no joke. I mean, it's probably almost a fourth of my mortgage. So, I mean, the concept of structures is pretty simple, y'all. It either has it or it doesn't. If it does, are they going to work for you? Our decision when we looked at the property, yeah, we can make these structures work for us. They may not be the prettiest, they may not be the best, but we can make them work. And we're going to go ahead and round this out with the land itself. So we're going to talk about like the size of property you're looking for a little bit. We are going to talk about like the soil conditions a little bit. And we'll talk about like the type of land it is, maybe what it was used for before, what it's going to be good for in the future. Now, some of the things that I liked about my land when we came out here and we're looking around was that it had some trees on it. A lot of land in Central Texas is former farmland from, decades ago, if not longer. And one of the things people do when they're trying to grow crops in the ground is they come through and they rip out all the trees. Well, that's fine, except when you're trying to raise livestock, it's nice to have some trees. So, I mean, great big trees like that one there, great big trees like these here are part of what attracted us to the property. I can set up a little pig run right there on the north side of those trees, and these trees on the south side of that paddock will cast shade down onto the paddock. Maybe the entire paddock doesn't have shade, but there is a shady place for the pigs to go. One of the other things I really liked about the property was the slope. That direction is due north, and as you can see, there's quite a uphill gradient towards the north here. So the road is up there, and directly back behind me is the creek bed. So everything slopes from the road down to the creek. What that gives me, y'all? A south-facing slope. And what's a south-facing slope really good for? Putting in orchards. Before we even bought the property, when I was just over here looking at it, I was asking myself questions like, where am I going to put my garden? And while there was a lot of trees and a lot of weeds in the area that I was going to put my garden, I could have a very clear vision for it as soon as I was looking at the property. And sure enough, as soon as we moved on, we watched the property for about 6 to 8 months, watched water flows, tried to figure out kind of some of the solar aspects, and the area that I was thinking would be good for a garden ended up being great for a garden. You see, y'all, the creek is right down there. So what happens is the water comes down the property. It runs up to this elevated area and then down into this gully and down to the creek. So this elevated area, I knew, sorry for the sun glare, y'all, was going to be a great place to come and put a garden in. It sits high, so obviously it's going to drain low, so I didn't have to worry about it becoming a muggy bog mess. As you can tell by the fact that I'm walking towards the garden and we keep getting all this sun glare, we get really good solar exposure during our growing season. And one of the added benefits is that if you've got water coming down your property, the bad side of that is that it's carrying nutrients from other portions of your property down to the creek. But by putting the garden where we did, that means that this soil here surrounding the garden is catching some of those nutrients on their way to the creek. We plan on doing some stuff in the future. If any of y'all are familiar with installing swales, that's going to help kind of catch water up on the top of the property, get those nutrients to settle back out, and then hopefully it's just water that continues on down the property. But that's future projects. The bottom line was, when I was looking for this property, I was thinking, where am I going to put a garden? And it ended up working out pretty well. How much land do you need? Well, y'all, that really depends on your needs, and also kind of thinking ahead a little bit, I guess, that your needs may change. I can tell you this. We wanted the 15 or 20 acre property. The 5, almost 6 acre property that we found with the house, it was what we could afford. So you might say we settled, but for the first 3 years that we were on this property, This 5 acres is all I could handle. If this property had been any bigger, it would have liked to kill me. Maintaining the linear footage of fence that it takes to encompass a 5 acre piece of property, that's a lot of fence to keep an eye on, y'all. And birds like to land on fences, which means that everything likes to grow on fences. Trying to transition the soil from primarily pioneer species, which a lot of people call weeds, but trying to transition the soil from a lot of pioneer species into more like native prairie type grasses, and then trying to get some improved grasses going. It has been a ton of work with just the 5 acres that I have. Now, with that being said, we've got this 5 acres pretty much under control, and now it's really just a matter of maintaining it. We're not doing so much of the cutting in of trails and downing of dead trees and you know, going through briar patches and thickets and trying to get all the thorny, nasty vines out. A lot of that work is already done. So now just keeping an eye on it and using some mechanical methods to keep it maintained, it's relatively easy. And now that we've gotten into the pigs and the pig operation is growing, I'm not gonna lie, y'all, I wish I had more land. Yes, you need to be a little bit forward thinking about what you need from the land and what you're going to use the land for. You should also have an idea of like what type of maybe agricultural or timber exemptions may be available to you. You know, there's a lot of places in a lot of states where if property is heavily wooded and you maintain it as wooded property, you can get that timber exemption. And also it's a good opportunity to make some money. You know, you hire a company to come in once every couple of years and thin out some of the really large old growth timber. You get a fat paycheck for it. It lets more sunlight get down to the ground so that the little trees can start growing up and start becoming old growth timber someday. Is your dream to have some sort of a small scale beef operation? Well, if that's the case, thick, heavily wooded areas are probably not going to be the best for you. You need some prairie, you need some pasture, you need some grass, so you need some sunlight. Like I said, I like having trees on the property, but because of the type of pigs that I raise or the types of cattle I would consider having on the property, having everything as wide open as possible and just having trees in places where they can serve as shade is what works for me. Soil type, I'll tell you what, y'all. We are sitting in an area of Texas that's kind of known as like the Edwards transition zone. If you go a little bit east of us, you start getting into the black soil prairie land. If you go further west of us, it just gets rockier and rockier. Not too far south, you're starting to get into southern plains. We kind of sit right in the middle of all of that. And I'll tell you what, y'all, I could dig 10 holes in 10 different places on my property and find 10 different kinds of soils. But you know what? That's okay, because there are some trees that grow better in a sandy, well-drained soil, and there are some trees that grow better in more of a clay loam. So by just kind of finding out what's going on with my property, I just plant different things in different places. But if you already have an idea of what it is you want to do with your property, you're going to want to make sure that you find a piece of property that's going to be conducive to doing that. It doesn't do any good to say like, oh, I'm going to be a blueberry farmer and then find out that your soils are not nearly acidic enough to support, you know, large scale blueberry crops. Now, that's not to say that can't be fixed. I'm telling y'all, you can build soil and you can build whatever kind of soil you want. I've got plenty of places on my property that the topsoil was maybe 6 inches thick, but through wood chips and composting and throwing fruit scraps out and letting pigs dig through it and having pigs deposit their nutrients, and the grass grows up and we cut it, and the grass grows up and we cut it. Those areas that 3 years ago had 6 inches of topsoil, now they're pushing closer to 9 inches of topsoil. We are actually building earth on this property. So again, y'all, when you're looking for property, just consider things like, what do I want to use the property for? Is it already conducive to that, or am I going to have to do a lot of building? When I say a lot of building, it could be a lot of building of structures, or it could just be a lot of building of like building soil or building other types of infrastructure. Try to look for things like southward facing slopes. You know, if you're planning on putting in a garden on the northward facing side of the base of a mountain to where your garden gets an hour of direct sunlight a day, well, you're gonna have a garden that's gonna suffer quite a bit. If you're gonna buy a property and you want to raise pigs on it or raise cows on it and there is not a tree in sight, well, guess what? You're gonna be bringing in some sort of a shade structure until you can get some trees growing up. So y'all, try to find out who the neighbors are. Try to find out if they're going to be supportive of the type of lifestyle that you want to lead. Take a good look at the land, see if it's going to meet your needs. Don't hesitate to ask the seller if they'll let you take a soil sample, ship it into the lab. They usually have it back to you in a week or so. Don't be afraid of a property that has no structures on it. If it does have structures on it, again, just make sure they're going to be conducive to your needs. So y'all, these 3 topics basically, along with all the other topics that I talked about in video A and video B, you know, I mean, that's kind of the vast majority of it. Is there other little nitpicky stuff you could talk about? Sure, but I'm not going to start getting into loan types and all that kind of stuff. We're just talking about how to take those first steps to getting that homestead. We've gone through an entire series of from changing your mental attitude up to what to look for in a property. This is going to be the end of this particular series, y'all, and where we're going to kind of pick up into this next is kind of that, now you got the property, so now what? And we'll jump into that in the new year. So y'all, I hope you've enjoyed videos 1 through 5C of the First Steps to Getting Your Homestead series. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them down below or shoot me an email. You can always find a way to get in touch with us at our website, rockin8farm.com. If you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. I wish y'all well. I hope y'all find your homestead. And until I see y'all again, this has been Chris with Rockin8 Farm. Be happy and live healthy.